Welcome in. Let's have a story. This is part of a series of videos where I'm reading To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. In the description you'll find a link to a playlist of all the videos, along with timestamps if you want to skip ahead. If you aren't familiar with Virginia Woolf, know that her writing style is a little unusual. She doesn't use traditional narration or dialogue, but instead puts you inside the minds of the characters and lets you listen in on their stream of consciousness. So it jumps around in strange ways, just like a person's thoughts jump around. The book To the Lighthouse is in 3 parts, each with several chapters. The first part is called The Window. Let's begin. Chapter 17. But what have I done with my life, thought Mrs. Ramsay, taking her place at the head of the table and looking at all the plates, making white circles on it. William, sit by me, she said. Lily, she said warily, over there. They had that. Paul Rayleigh and Minta Doyle. She, only this. An infinitely long table and plates and knives. At the far end was her husband, sitting down all in a heap, frowning. What at she did not know. She did not mind. She could not understand how she had ever felt any emotion or affection for him. She had a sense of being past everything, through everything, out of everything, as she helped the soup, as if there was an eddy there and one could be in it or could be out of it, and she was out of it. It's all come to an end, she thought, while they came in one after another. Charles Tansley, sit there, please, she said. Augustus Carmichael, and sat down. And meanwhile she waited passively for someone to answer her, for something to happen. But this is not a thing, she thought, ladling out soup, that one says. Raising her eyebrows at the discrepancy, that was what she was thinking, this was what she was doing. Ladling out soup, she felt more and more strongly outside that eddy. Or as if a shade had fallen and robbed of color, she saw things truly. The room, she looked around it, was very shabby. There was no beauty anywhere. She forbore to look at Mr. Tansley. Nothing seemed to have merged. They all sat separate, and the whole of the effort of merging and flowing and creating rested on her. Again she felt, as a fact, without hostility, the sterility of men, for if she did not do it, nobody would do it, and so, giving herself a little shake that one gives a watch that has stopped, the old familiar pulse began beating as the watch begins ticking. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And so on, she repeated, listening to it, sheltering and fostering the still feeble pulse as one might guard a weak flame with a newspaper. And so then, she concluded, addressing herself by bending slightly in his direction to William Banks, poor man who had no wife and no children and dined alone in lodgings except for tonight. And in pity for him, life being now strong enough to bear her on again, she began all this business. As a sailor, not without weariness, sees the wind fill his sail and yet hardly wants to be off again and thinks how, had the ship sunk, he would have whirled round and found rest on the floor of the sea. Did you find your letters? I told them to put them in the hall for you, she said to William Banks. Lily Briscoe watched her drifting into that strange no-man's land where to follow people is impossible, and yet their going inflicts such a chill on those who watch them that they always try to at least follow them with their eyes as one follows a fading ship until the sails have sunk beneath the horizon. How old she looks, how worn she looks, Lily thought, and how remote. Then she turned to William Banks, smiling. It was as if the ship had turned and the sun had struck its sails again, and Lily thought with some amusement, because she was relieved, why does she pity him? For that was the impression she gave when she told him that his letters were in the hall. Poor William Banks, she seemed to be saying, as if her own weariness had been partly pitying people, and the life in her, her resolve to live again, had been stirred by pity. And it was not true, Lily thought. It was one of those misjudgments of hers that seemed to be instinctive and to arise from some need of her own rather than of other people's. He is not in the least pitiable. He has his work, Lily said to herself. She remembered, all of a sudden, as if she had found a treasure, that she had her work. In a flash, she saw her picture and thought, yes, I shall put the tree further in the middle. Then I shall avoid that awkward space. That's what I shall do. That's what has been puzzling me. She took up the salt cellar and put it down again on a flower pattern in the tablecloth, so as to remind herself to move the tree. It's odd that one scarcely gets anything worth having by post, yet one always wants one's letters, said Mr. Banks. What damned rot they talk, thought Charles Tansley, laying down his spoon precisely in the middle of his plate, which he had swept clean as if, Lily thought, he sat opposite her with his back to the window, precisely in the middle of view. He were determined to make sure of his meals. Everything about him had that meager fixity, that bare unloveliness. But nevertheless, the fact remained, it was impossible to dislike anyone if one looked at them. She liked his eyes. They were blue, deep-set, frightening. "Do you write many letters, Mr. Tansley?" asked Mrs. Ramsay, pitying him too, Lily supposed, for that was true of Mrs. Ramsay. She pitied men, always, as if they lacked something. Women never, as if they had something. He wrote to his mother, otherwise he did not suppose he wrote one letter a month, said Mr. Tansley, shortly. For he was not going to talk the sort of rot these condescended to by these silly women. He had been reading in his room, and now he came down, and it all seemed to him silly, superficial, flimsy. Why did they dress? He had come down in his ordinary clothes. He had not got any dress clothes. One never gets anything worth having by post. That was the sort of thing they were always saying. They made men say that sort of thing. Yes, it was pretty well true, he thought. They never got anything worth having from one year's end to another. They did nothing but talk, 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 eat, eat, eat. It was the women's fault. Women made civilization impossible with all their charm and all their silliness. "No going to the lighthouse tomorrow, Mrs. Ramsay," he said, asserting himself. He liked her, he admired her, he still thought of the man in the drainpipe, looking up at her, but he felt it necessary to assert himself. He was really, Lily Briscoe thought, in spite of his eyes. But then look at his nose, look at his hands. The most uncharming human being she had ever met. Then why did she mind what he said? Women can't write, women can't paint. What did that matter coming from him, since clearly it was not true to him, but for some reason helpful to him? And that was why he said it. Why did her whole being bow like corn under a wind and erect itself again from this abasement, only with a great and rather painful effort? She must make it once more. There's the sprig on the tablecloth. There's my painting. I must move the tree to the middle. That matters, nothing else. Could she not hold fast to that, she asked herself, and not lose her temper and not argue, and if she wanted revenge, take it by laughing at him? "Oh, Mr. Tansley," she said, "do take me to the lighthouse with you. I should so love it." She was telling lies, he could see. She was saying what she did not mean to annoy him for some reason. She was laughing at him. He was in his old flannel trousers. He had no others. He felt very rough and isolated and lonely. He knew that she was trying to tease him for some reason. She didn't want to go to the lighthouse with him. She despised him. So did Prue Ramsay. So did they all. But he was not going to be made a fool of by women. So he turned deliberately in his chair and looked out of the window and said, all in a jerk, very rudely, "It would be too rough for her tomorrow. She would be sick." It annoyed him that she should have made him speak like that with Mrs. Ramsay listening. If only he could be alone in his room, working, he thought, among his books. That was where he felt at ease. And he had never run a penny into debt. He had never cost his father a penny since he was 15. He had helped them at home out of his savings. He was educating his sister. Still, he wished he had known how to answer Miss Briscoe properly. He wished it had not come out all in a jerk like that. "You would be sick." He wished he could think of something to say to Mrs. Ramsay, something which would show her that he was not just a dry prig. That was all they thought about him. He turned to her. But Mrs. Ramsay was talking about people he had never heard of to William Banks. "Yes, take it away," she said briefly, interrupting what she was saying to William Banks to speak to the maid. "It must have been 15, no, 20 years ago that I last saw her," she was saying, turning back to him again as if she could not lose a moment of their talk, for she was absorbed by what they were saying. So he had actually heard from her this evening. And was Carrie still living at Marlow, and was everything still the same? Oh, she could remember it as if it were yesterday, on the river, feeling it as if it were yesterday, going on the river, feeling very cold. But if the Mannings made a plan, they stuck to it. And never should she forget Herbert killing a wasp with a teaspoon on the bank. And it was still going on, Mrs. Ramsay mused, gliding like a ghost among the chairs and tables of that drawing room on the bank of the Thames, where she had been so very, very cold 20 years ago. But now she went among them like a ghost, and it fascinated her as if while she had changed that particular day, now become very still and beautiful, had remained there all these years. Had Carrie written to him herself, she asked. Yes, she says they're building a new billiard room, he said. No, that was out of the question. Building a new billiard room. It seemed to her impossible. Mr. Banks could not see that there was anything very odd about it. They were very well off now. Should he give her love to Carrie? Oh, Mrs. Ramsay said with a little start. No, she added, reflecting that she did not know this Carrie who built a new billiard room. But how strange, she repeated, to Mr. Banks's amusement, that they should be going on there still. For it was extraordinary to think that they had been capable of going on living all these years when she had not thought of them more than once, all that time. How eventful her own life had been during those same years, yet perhaps Carrie Manning had not thought about her either. The thought was strange and distasteful. People soon drift apart, said Mr. Banks, feeling, however, some satisfaction when he thought that, after all, he knew both the Mannings and the Ramsays. He had not drifted apart, he thought, laying down his spoon and wiping his clean-shaven lips punctiliously. But perhaps he was rather unusual, he thought, in this. He never let himself get into a groove. He had friends in all circles. Mrs. Ramsay had to break off here to tell the maid something about keeping the food hot. That was why he preferred dining alone. All those interruptions annoyed him. Well, thought William Banks, preserving a demeanor of exquisite courtesy and merely spreading the fingers of his left hand on the tablecloth as a mechanic examines a tool beautifully polished and ready for use in an interval of leisure. Such are the sacrifices one's friends ask of one. It would have hurt her if he had refused to come, but it was not worth it for him. Looking at his hand, he thought that if he had been alone, dinner would have been almost over now. He would have been free to work. Yes, he thought, it is a terrible waste of time. The children were dropping in still. I wish one of you would run up to Roger's room, Mrs. Ramsay was saying. How trifling it all is, how boring it all is, he thought, compared with the other thing, work. Here he sat, drumming his fingers on the tablecloth when he might have been. He took a flashing bird's-eye view of his work. What a waste of time it all was, to be sure. Yet he thought, she is one of my oldest friends. I am, by way of being devoted to her. Yet now, at this moment, her presence meant absolutely nothing to him. Her beauty meant nothing to him. Her sitting with her little boy at the window, nothing. He wished only to be alone and to take up that book. He felt uncomfortable. He felt treacherous that he could sit by her side and feel nothing for her. The truth was that he did not enjoy family life. It was in this sort of state that one asked oneself, what does one live for? Why, one asked oneself, does one take all these pains for the human race to go on? Is it so very desirable? Are we attractive as a species? Not so very, he thought, looking at those rather untidy boys. His favorite, Cam, was in bed, he supposed. Foolish questions, vain questions, questions one never asked if one was occupied. Is human life this? Is human life that? One never had time to think about it, but here he was, asking himself that sort of question because Mrs. Ramsay was giving orders to servants. And also because it struck him, thinking how surprised Mrs. Ramsay was that Carrie Manning should still exist. That friendships, even the best of them, are frail things, one drifts apart. He reproached himself again. He was sitting beside Mrs. Ramsay, and he had nothing in the world to say to her. "I'm so sorry," said Mrs. Ramsay, turning to him at last. He felt rigid and barren, like a pair of boots that have been soaked and gone dry so that you can hardly force your feet into them. Yet he must force his feet into them. He must make himself talk. Unless he were very careful, she would find out at this treachery of his that he did not care a straw for her, and that would not be at all pleasant, he thought. So he bent his head courteously in her direction. "How you must detest dining in this bare garden," she said, making use, as she did when she was distracted, of her social manner. So, when there is a strife of tongues at some meeting, the chairman, to obtain unity, suggests that everyone shall speak in French. Perhaps it is bad French. French may not contain the words that express the speaker's thoughts. Nevertheless, speaking French imposes some order, some uniformity. Replying to her in the same language, Mr. Banks said, "No, not at all." And Mr. Tansley, who had no knowledge of this language, even spoke thus in words of one syllable, at once suspected its insincerity. They did talk nonsense, he thought, the Ramsays, and he pounced on this fresh instance with joy, making a note which one of these days he would read aloud to one or two friends. There, in a society where one could say what one liked, he would sarcastically describe staying with the Ramsays and what nonsense they talked. It was worth while doing it once, he would say, but not again. The women bored one so, he would say. Of course, Ramsay had dished himself by marrying a beautiful woman and having 8 children. It would shape itself, something like that, but now, at this moment, sitting there, stuck with an empty seat beside him, nothing had shaped itself at all. It was all in scraps and fragments. He felt extremely, even physically uncomfortable. He wanted somebody to give him a chance of asserting himself. He wanted it so urgently that he fidgeted in his chair, looked at this person and then at that person, and tried to break into their talk, opened his mouth and shut it again. They were talking about the fishing industry. Why did no one ask him his opinion? What did they know about the fishing industry? Lily Briscoe knew all that. Sitting opposite him, could she not see, as in an X-ray photograph, the ribs and thigh bones of the young man's desire to impress himself, lying dark in the midst of his flesh? That thin mist which convention had laid over his burning desire to break into the conversation. But, she thought, screwing up her Chinese eyes, and remembering how he sneered at women, can't paint, can't write. Why should I help him to relieve himself? There is a code of behavior, she knew, whose 7th article, it may be, says that on occasions of this sort it behooves the woman, whatever her own occupation might be, to go to the help of the young man opposite so that he may expose and relieve the thigh bones, the ribs of his vanity, of his urgent desire to assert himself. As indeed it is their duty, she reflected in her old maidenly fairness, to help us. Suppose the tube were to burst into flames. Then, she thought, I should certainly expect Mr. Tansley to get me out. But how would it be, she thought, if neither of us did either of these things? So She sat there, smiling. "You're not planning to go to the lighthouse, are you, Lily?" said Mrs. Ramsay. "Remember poor Mr. Langley. He had been round the world dozens of times, but he told me he never suffered as he did when my husband took him there." "Are you a good sailor, Mr. Tansley?" she asked. Mr. Tansley raised a hammer, swung it high in the air, but realizing as it descended that he could not smite that butterfly with such an instrument as this, said only that he had never been sick in his life. But in that one sentence lay compact like gunpowder that his grandfather was a fisherman, his father a chemist, that he had worked his way up entirely himself, that he was proud of it, that he was Charles Tansley, a fact that nobody there seemed to realize. But one of these days, every single person would know it. He scowled ahead of him. He could almost pity these mild, cultivated people who would be blown sky high like bales of wool and barrels of apple one of these days by the gunpowder that was in him. "Will you take me, Mr. Tansley?" said Lily quickly, kindly, for, of course, if Mrs. Ramsay said to her, as in effect she did, "I am drowning, my dear, in seas of fire, unless you apply some balm to the anguish of this hour and say something nice to that young man there, life will run up upon the rocks. Indeed, I hear the grating and the growling at this minute. My nerves are taut as fiddle strings. Another touch, and they will snap." When Mrs. Ramsay said all this, as the glance in her eyes said it, of course, for the 150th time, Lily Briscoe had to renounce the experiment. What happens if one is not nice to that young man there? And be nice. Judging the turn in her mood correctly, that she was friendly to him now, he was relieved of his egotism and told her how he had been thrown out of a boat when he was a baby, how his father used to fish him out with a boat hook. That was how he learnt to swim. One of his uncles kept the light on some rock or the other off the Scottish coast, he said. He had been there with him in a storm. This was said loudly in a pause. They had to listen to him when he said that he had been with his uncle in a lighthouse in a storm. Ah, thought Lily Briscoe, as the conversation took this auspicious turn, and she felt Mrs. Ramsay's gratitude, for Mrs. Ramsay was free now to talk for a moment herself. Ah, she thought, but what haven't I paid to get it for you? She had not been sincere. She had done the usual trick, been nice. She would never know him. He would never know her. Human relations were all like that, she thought, and the worst, if it had not been for Mr. Banks, were between men and women. Inevitably, these were extremely insincere, she thought. Then her eye caught the salt cellar, which she had placed there to remind her, and she remembered that next morning she would move the tree further towards the middle, and her spirits rose so high at the thought of painting tomorrow that she laughed out loud at what Mr. Tansley was saying. Let him talk all night, if he liked it. But how long do they leave men on a lighthouse, she asked. He told her he was amazingly well informed, and as he was grateful, and as he liked her, and as he was beginning to enjoy himself, so now, Mrs. Ramsay thought, she could return to that dreamland, that unreal but fascinating place, the Mannings' drawing room at Marlow 20 years ago, where one moved about without haste or anxiety, for there was no future to worry about. She knew what had happened to them, what to her. It was like reading a good book again, for she knew the end of the story since it happened 20 years ago, and life, which shot down even from this dining room table in Cascades, heaven knows where, was sealed up there and lay like a lake placidly between its banks. He said they had built a billiard room. Was it possible? Would William go on talking about the Mannings? She wanted him to. But no, for some reason he was no longer in the mood. She tried. He did not respond. She could not force him. She was disappointed. The children are disgraceful, she said, sighing. He said something about punctuality being one of the minor virtues which we do not acquire until later in life. If at all, said Mrs. Ramsay, merely to fill up space, thinking what an old maid William was becoming. Conscious of his treachery, conscious of her wish to talk about something more intimate, yet out of the mood for it at present, he felt come over him the disagreeableness of life, sitting there, waiting. Perhaps the others were saying something interesting. What were they saying? That the fishing season was bad, that the men were emigrating. They were talking about wages and unemployment. The young man was abusing the government. William Banks, thinking what a relief it was to catch on to something of this sort when private life was disagreeable, heard him say something about one of the most scandalous acts of the present government. Lily was listening. Mrs. Ramsay was listening. They were all listening, but already bored, Lily felt that something was lacking. Mr. Banks felt that something was lacking. Pulling her shawl around her, Mrs. Ramsay felt that something was lacking. All of them, bending themselves to listen, thought, "Pray heaven that the inside of my mind may not be exposed." For each thought, the others are feeling this. They are outraged and indignant with the government about the fishermen, whereas I feel nothing at all. But perhaps, thought Mr. Banks as he looked at Mr. Tansley, here is the man. One was always waiting for the man. There was always a chance. At any moment, the leader might rise, the man of genius. In politics, as in anything else. Probably he will be extremely disagreeable to us old fogies, thought Mr. Banks, doing his best to make allowances, for he knew by some curious physical sensation as of nerves erect in his spine that he was jealous for himself, partly more probably for his work, for his point of view, for his science, and therefore he was not entirely open-minded or altogether fair. For Mr. Tansley seemed to be saying, "You have wasted your lives. You are all of you wrong. Poor old fogies, you're hopelessly behind the times." He seemed to be rather cocksure, this young man, and his manners were bad. But Mr. Banks bade himself observe. He had courage. He had ability. He was extremely well up in the facts. Probably, Mr. Banks thought, as Tansley abused the government. There is a good deal in what he says. "Tell me now," he said. So they argued about politics, and Lily looked at the leaf on the tablecloth. And Mrs. Ramsay, leaving the argument entirely in the hands of the two men, wondered why she was so bored by this talk, and wished, looking at her husband on the other end of the table, that he would say something. One word, she said to herself. For if he said a thing, it would make all the difference. He went to the heart of things. He cared about fishermen and their wages. He could not sleep for thinking of them. It was altogether different when he spoke. One did not feel then, pray heaven, You don't see how little I care, because one did care. Then, realizing that it was because she admired him so much that she was wanting for him to speak, she felt as if somebody had been praising her husband to her and their marriage, and she glowed all over without realizing that it was she herself who had praised him. She looked at him, thinking to find this in his face. He would be looking magnificent, but not in the least. He was screwing his face up. He was scowling and frowning and flushing with anger. What on earth was it about, she wondered. What could be the matter? Only that poor old Augustus had asked for another plate of soup. That was all. It was unthinkable. It was detestable. So he signaled to her across the table that Augustus should be beginning his soup over again. He loathed people eating when he had finished. She saw his anger fly like a pack of hounds into his eyes, his brow, and she knew that in a moment something violent would explode, and then, thank goodness, she saw him clutch himself and clap a brake on the wheel, and the whole of his body seemed to emit sparks, but not words. He sat there, scowling. He had said nothing. He would have her observe. Let her give him the credit for that. But why, after all, should poor Augustus not ask for another plate of soup? He had merely touched Ellen's arm and said, "Ellen, please, another plate of soup." And then Mr. Ramsay scowled like that. And why not? Mrs. Ramsay demanded. Surely they could let Augustus have his soup if he wanted it. He hated people wallowing in food, Mr. Ramsay frowned at her. He hated everything dragging on for hours like this, but he had controlled himself, Mr. Ramsay would have her observe, disgusting though the sight was. But why show it so plainly? Mrs. Ramsay demanded. They looked at each other down the long table, sending these questions and answers across, each knowing exactly what the other felt. Everybody could see, Mrs. Ramsay thought. There was Rose gazing at her father. There was Roger gazing at his father. Both would be off in spasms of laughter another second, she knew, so she said promptly, indeed it was time. Light the candles. And they jumped up instantly and went and fumbled at the sideboard. Why could he never conceal his feelings, Mrs. Ramsay wondered. And she wondered if Augustus Carmichael had noticed. Perhaps he had, perhaps he had not. She could not help respecting the composure with which he sat there, drinking his soup. If he wanted soup, he asked for soup. Whether people laughed at him or were angry with him, he was the same. He did not like her. She knew that. But partly for that very reason she respected him, and looking at him, drinking soup, very large and calm in the failing light, and monumental and contemplative, she wondered what he did feel then, and why he was always content and dignified. And she thought how devoted he was to Andrew, and would call him into his room, and Andrew said, "Show him things." There he would lie all day long on the lawn, brooding presumably over his poetry, till he reminded one of a cat watching birds, and then he clapped his paws together when he had found the word, and her husband said, "Poor old Augustus, he's a true poet," which was high praise from her husband. Now 8 candles were stood down on the table, and after the first stoop, the flames stood upright and drew with them into visibility the long table entire, and in the middle a yellow and purple dish of fruit. What had she done with it? Mrs. Ramsay wondered, for Rose's arrangement of the grapes and pears, of the horny, pink-lined shell of the bananas, made her think of a trophy fetched from the bottom of the sea, of Neptune's banquet, of the bunch that hangs with vine leaves over the shoulder of Bacchus in some picture, among the leopard skins and the torches lolloping red and gold. Thus, brought up suddenly into the light, it seemed, possessed of that great size and depth, was like a world in which one could take one's staff and climb hills, she thought, or go down into valleys. And to her pleasure for it brought them into sympathy momentarily. She saw that Augustus, too, feasted his eyes on the same plate of fruit, plunged in, broke off a bloom there, a tassel here, and returned, after feasting, to his hive. That was his way of looking, different from hers, but looking together united them. Now all the candles were lit up, and the faces on both sides of the table were brought nearer by the candlelight, and composed as they had not been in the twilight, into a party round a table, for the night was now shut off by panes of glass, which, far from giving any accurate view of the outside world, rippled it so strangely that here, inside the room, seemed to be order and dry land. There, outside, a reflection in which things waved and vanished, waterily. Some change at once went through them all, as if this had really happened, and they were all conscious of making a party together in a hollow, on an island, had their common cause against that fluidity out there. Mrs. Ramsay, who had been uneasy waiting for Paul and Minta to come in, and unable, she felt, to settle to things, now felt her uneasiness changed to expectation. For now they must come, and Lily Briscoe, trying to analyze the cause of the sudden exhilaration, compared it with that moment on the tennis lawn when solidity suddenly vanished, and such vast spaces lay between them. And now the same effect was got by the many candles in the sparely furnished room, and the uncurtained windows, and the bright, mask-like look of faces seen by candlelight. Some weight was taken off them. Anything might happen, she felt. They must come now, Mrs. Ramsay thought, looking at the door, and in that instant, Minta Doyle, Paul Rayleigh, and a maid carrying a great dish in her hands came in together. They were awfully late. They were horribly late, Minta said, and as they found their way to different ends of the table. "I lost my brooch, my grandmother's brooch," said Minta, with a sound of lamentation in her voice, and a suffusion in her large brown eyes, looking down, looking up, as she sat by Mr. Ramsay, which roused his chivalry so that he bantered her. How could she be such a goose, he asked, as to scramble about rocks in jewels? She was, by way of being terrified of him. He was so fearfully clever, and the first night when she had sat by him and he had talked about George Eliot, she had been really frightened, for she had left the third volume of Middlemarch in the train, and she never knew what happened in the end. But afterwards she got on perfectly and made herself out even more ignorant than she was, because he liked telling her she was a fool. And so tonight, directly, he laughed at her, and she was not frightened. Besides, she knew, directly she came into the room, that the miracle had happened. She wore her golden haze. Sometimes she had it, sometimes not. She never knew why it came or why it went, or if she had it, until she came into the room. And then she knew instantly by the way some man looked at her. Yes, tonight she had it, tremendously. She knew by the way Mr. Ramsay told her not to be a fool. She sat beside him, smiling. It must have happened then, thought Mrs. Ramsay. They are engaged. And for a moment she felt what she had never expected to feel again: jealousy. For he, her husband, felt it too. Minta's glow. He liked these girls, these golden reddish girls with something flying, something a little wild and harum-scarum about them, who didn't scrape their hair off, weren't, as he said about poor Lily Briscoe, skimpy. There was some quality which she herself had not, some luster, some richness which attracted him, amused him, led him to make favorites of girls like Minta. They might cut his hair from him, plait him watch chains, or interrupt him at his work, hailing him. She heard them. "Come along, Mr. Ramsay, it's our turn to beat them now." And out he came to play tennis. But indeed she was not jealous, only now and then, when she made herself look in her glass a little resentful that she had grown old, perhaps by her own fault. The bill for the greenhouse and all the rest of it. She was grateful to them for laughing at him. "How many pipes have you smoked today, Mr. Ramsay?" And so on, till he seemed a young man, a man very attractive to women, not burdened, not weighed down with the greatness of his labors and the sorrows of the world and his fame or his failure. But again, as she had first known him, gaunt but gallant, helping her out of a boat, she remembered, with delightful ways like that. She looked at him, and he looked astonishingly young, teasing Minta. For herself, "Put it down there," she said, helping the Swiss girl to place gently before her the huge brown pot in which was the buff en daube. For her own part, she liked her boobies. Paul must sit by her. She had kept a place for him. Really, she sometimes thought she liked the boobies best. They did not bother one with their dissertations. How much they missed, after all, these very clever men. How dried up did they become, to be sure. There was something, she thought as she sat down, very charming about Paul. His manners were so delightful to her, and his sharp-cut nose and his bright blue eyes. He was so considerate. Would he tell her, now that they were all talking again, what had happened? "We went back to look for Minta's brooch," he said, sitting down by her. That was enough. She knew from the effort, the rise in his voice to surmount a difficult word, that it was the first time he had said, We did this, we did that. They'll say that all their lives, she thought, and an exquisite scent of olives and oil and juice rose from the great brown dish as Martha, with a little flourish, took the cover off. The cook had spent 3 days over that dish, and she must take great care, Mrs. Ramsay thought, diving into the soft mass, to choose a specially tender piece for William Beggs. And she peered into the dish with its shiny walls and its confusion of savory brown and yellow meats and its bay leaves and its wine, and thought, this will celebrate the occasion. A curious sense rising in her, at once freakish and tender, of celebrating a festival, as if two emotions were called up in her, one profound, for what could be more serious than the love of man for woman? What more commanding, more impressive, bearing in its bosom the seeds of death? At the same time, these lovers, these people, entering into illusion glittering-eyed, must be danced round with mockery, decorated with garlands. "It is a triumph," said Mr. Banks, laying his knife down for a moment. He had eaten attentively. It was rich, it was tender, it was perfectly cooked. How did she manage these things in the depths of this country? He asked her. She was a wonderful woman. All his love, all his reverence had returned, and she knew it. "It is a French recipe of my grandmother's," said Mrs. Ramsay, speaking with a ring of great pleasure in her voice. Of course, it was French. What passes for cookery in England is an abomination, they agreed. It is putting cabbages in water. It is roasting meat till it is like leather. It is cutting off the delicious skins of vegetables, in which, said Mr. Bank, all the virtue of the vegetable is contained. "And the waste," said Mrs. Ramsay. "A whole French family could live on what an English cook throws away." Spurred on by her sense that William's affection had come back to her, and that everything was all right again, and that her suspense was over, and that now she was free to both triumph and to mock, she laughed, she gesticulated, till Lily thought how childlike, how absurd she was, sitting up there with all her beauty opened again in her, talking about the skins of vegetables. There was something frightening about her. She was irresistible. Always she got her own way in the end, Lily thought. Now she had brought this off. Paul and Minta, one might suppose, were engaged. Mr. Banks was dining here. She put a spell on them all by wishing so simply, so directly. And Lily contrasted that abundance with her own poverty of spirit, and supposed that it was partly that belief, for her face was all lit up. Without looking young, she looked radiant. In this strange, this terrifying thing which made Paul Rayleigh sitting at her side, all of a tremor, yet abstract, absorbed, silent. Mrs. Ramsay, Lily felt, as she talked about the skins of vegetables, exalted that, worshipped that, held her hands over it, to warm them, to protect it, and yet, having brought it all about, somehow laughed, led her victims, Lily felt, to the altar. It came over her too now, the emotion, the vibration of love. How inconspicuous she felt herself by Paul's side, he glowing, burning, she aloof, satirical. He bound for adventure, she moored to the shore. He launched, incautious, she solitary, left out, and ready to implore a share if it were a disaster. In his disaster, she said shyly, "When did Minta lose her brooch?" He smiled, the most exquisite smile veiled by memory, tinged by dreams. He shook his head. "On the beach," he said. "I'm going to find it," he said. "I'm getting up early." This being kept secret from Minta, he lowered his voice and turned his eyes to where she sat, laughing, beside Mr. Ramsay. Lily wanted to protest violently and outrageously her desire to help him, envisaging how, in the dawn on the beach, she would be the one to pounce on the brooch half hidden by some stone, and thus herself be included among the sailors and adventurers. But what did he reply to her offer? She actually said, with an emotion that she seldom let appear, "Let me come with you." And he laughed. He meant yes or no, either perhaps. But it was not his meaning. It was the odd chuckle he gave, as if he had said, "Throw yourself over the cliff if you like, I don't care." He turned on her cheek. The heat of love, its horror, its cruelty, its unscrupulosity. It scorched her, and Lily, looking at Minta, being charming to Mr. Ramsay at the other end of the table, flinched for her exposed to these fangs, and was thankful. For at any rate, she said to herself, catching sight of the salt cellar on the pattern, she need not marry, thank heaven. She need not undergo that degradation. She was saved from that delusion. She would move the tree rather more to the middle. Such was the complexity of things. For what happened to her, especially staying with the Ramsays, was to be made to feel violently two opposite things at the same time. That's what you feel was one, that's what I feel was the other, and then they fought together in her mind as now. It is so beautiful, so exciting, this love, that I tremble on the verge of it and offer, quite out of my own habit, to look for a brooch on a beach. Also, it is the stupidest, most barbaric of human passions, and turns a nice young man with a profile like a gem's, Paul's was exquisite, into a bully with a crowbar. He was swaggering, he was insolent, in the Milet Road. Yet, she said to herself, from the dawn of time, odes have been sung to love, wreaths heaped and roses, and if you asked 9 people out of 10, they would say they wanted nothing but this, love, while the women, judging from her own experience, would all the time be feeling, this is not what we want. There is nothing more tedious, puerile, and inhumane than this. Yet it is also beautiful and necessary. Well then, she asked, somehow expecting the others to go on with the argument, as if in an argument like this one threw one's own little bolt, which fell short, obviously, and left the others to carry it on. She listened again to what they were saying, in case they should throw any light upon the question of love. Then, said Mr. Banks, there is that liquid that the English call coffee. Oh, coffee, said Mrs. Ramsay. But it was much rather a question. She was thoroughly roused, Lily could see, and talked very emphatically. Of real butter and clean milk. Speaking with warmth and eloquence, she described the iniquity of the English dairy system, and in what state milk was delivered at the door, and was about to prove her charges, for she had gone into the matter, when all round the table, beginning with Andrew in the middle, like a fire leaping from tuft to tuft of furs, her children laughed, her husband laughed, she was laughed at, fire encircled, and forced to veil her crest, dismount her batteries, and only retaliate by displaying the raillery and ridicule of the table to Mr. Banks as an example of what one suffered if one attacked the prejudices of the British public. Purposely, however, for she had it on her mind that Lily, who had helped her with Mr. Tansley, was out of things. She exempted her from the rest, said, Lily, anyhow, agrees with me, and so drew her in a little fluttered, a little startled, for she was thinking about love. They were both out of things, Mrs. Ramsay had been thinking, both Lily and Charles Tansley. Both suffered from the glow of the other two. He, it was clear, felt himself utterly in the cold. No woman would look at him with Paul Rayleigh in the room. Poor fellow. Still, he had his dissertation. The influence of somebody upon something. He would take care of himself. With Lily, it was different. She faded under Minta's glow, became more inconspicuous than ever in her little gray dress with her little puckered face and her little Chinese eyes. Everything about her was so small. Yet, thought Mrs. Ramsay, comparing her with Minta, she claimed her help, for Lily would bear her out. She talked no more about her diaries than her husband did about his boots. He would talk by the hour about his boots. Of the two, Lily at 40 will be the better. There was in Lily a thread of something, a flare of something of her own, which Mrs. Ramsay liked very much indeed. But no man would, she feared. Obviously not, unless it were a much older man, like William Banks. But then he cared. Well, Mrs. Ramsay sometimes thought that he cared since his wife's death. Perhaps for her. He was not in love, of course. It was one of those unclassified affections of which there are so many. Oh, but nonsense, she thought. William must marry Lily. They have so many things in common. Lily is so fond of flowers. They are both cold and aloof and rather self-sufficing. She must arrange for them to take a long walk together. Foolishly, she had set them opposite each other. That could be remedied tomorrow. If it were fine, they should go for a picnic. Everything seemed possible. Everything seemed right. Just now. But this cannot last, she thought, dissociating herself from the moment while they were all talking about boots. Just now she had reached security. She hovered like a hawk suspended, like a flag floated in an element of joy which filled every nerve of her body fully and sweetly, not noisily, solemnly, rather, for it arose, she thought, looking at them all eating there, from husband and children and friends, all of which rising in this profound stillness. She was helping William Banks to one very small piece more, and peered into the depths of the earthenware pot. Seemed now, for no special reason, to stay there like a smoke, like a fume, rising upwards, holding them safe together. Nothing need be said, nothing could be said. There it was, all round them. It partook, she felt, carefully helping Mr. Banks to a specially tender piece of eternity, as she had already felt about something different once before in that afternoon. There is a coherence in things, a stability. Something, she meant, is immune from change and shines out. She glanced at the window with its ripple of reflected lights. In the face of the flowing, the fleeting, the spectral, like a ruby, so that again tonight she had the feeling that she had had once today already, of peace, of rest. Of such moments, she thought, the thing is made that endures. Yes, she assured William Banks, there is plenty for everybody. Andrew, she said, hold your plate lower or I shall spill it. The buff on daube was a perfect triumph. Here she felt, putting the spoon down where one could move or rest, could wait now. They were all helped, listening, could then, like a hawk which lapses suddenly from its high station, flaunt and sink on laughter easily. resting her whole weight upon what, at the other end of the table, her husband was saying about the square root of 1,253. That was the number, it seemed, on his watch. What did it all mean? To this day she had no notion. A square root. What was that? Her sons knew. She leant on them, on cubes and square roots. That was what they were talking about now. On Voltaire and Madame de Staël, on the character of Napoleon, on the French system of land tenure, on Lord Rosebery, on Creevy's memoirs. She let it uphold her and sustain her, this admirable fabric of the masculine intelligence, which ran up and down, crossed this way and that, like iron girders spanning the swaying fabric, upholding the world so that she could trust herself to it utterly, even shut her eyes or flicker them for a moment, as a child staring up from its pillow winks at the myriad layers of the leaves of a tree. Then she woke up. It was still being fabricated. William Banks was praising the Waverley novels. He read one of them every 6 months, he said. And why should that make Charles Tansley angry? He rushed in, all, thought Mrs. Ramsay, because Prue will not be nice to him, and denounced the Waverley novels when he knew nothing about it whatsoever, Mrs. Ramsay thought, observing him rather than listening to what he said. She could see how it was from his manner. He wanted to assert himself, and so it would always be with him till he got his professorship or married his wife, and so need not always be saying I. For that was what his criticism of poor Sir Walter, or perhaps it was Jane Austen, amounted to. I. He was thinking of himself and the impression he was making. She could tell by the sound of his voice, and his emphasis, and his uneasiness. Success would be good for him. At any rate, they were off again. Now she need not listen. It could not last, she knew, but at the moment her eyes were so clear that they seemed to go round the table, unveiling each of these people, and their thoughts and their feelings without effort, like a light stealing under water so that its ripples and the reeds in it and the minnows balancing themselves, and the sudden silent trout are all lit up, hanging, trembling. So she saw them. She heard them. But whatever they said had also this quality, as if what they said was like the movement of a trout when, at the same time, one can see the ripple and the gravel. Something to the right, something to the left, and the whole is held together. For whereas in active life she would be netting and separating one thing from another, she would be saying she liked the Waverley novels or had not read them. She would be urging herself forward. Now she said nothing. For the moment she hung suspended. But how long do you think it'll last? Said somebody. It was as if she had antennae trembling out from her, which, intercepting certain sentences, forced them upon her attention. This was one of them. She scented danger from her husband. A question like that would lead almost certainly to something being said which reminded him of his own failure. How long would he be read, he would think, at once? William Banks, who was entirely free from all such vanity, laughed and said he attached no importance to changes in fashion. Who could tell what was going to last in literature or indeed in anything else? let us enjoy what we do enjoy, he said. His integrity seemed to Mrs. Ramsay quite admirable. He never seemed for a moment to think, but how does this affect me? But then, if you had the other temperament, which must have praise, which must have encouragement, naturally you began, and she knew that Mr. Ramsay was beginning to be uneasy, to want somebody to say, oh, but your work will last, Mr. Ramsay, or something like that. He showed his uneasiness quite clearly now by saying with some irritation that anyhow Scott, or was it Shakespeare, would last him his lifetime. He said it irritably. Everybody, she thought, felt a little uncomfortable without knowing why. Then Minta Doyle, whose instinct was fine, said bluffly, absurdly, that she did not believe that anyone really enjoyed reading Shakespeare. Mr. Ramsay said grimly, but his mind was turned away again, that very few people liked it as much as they said they did. But, he added, there is considerable merit in some of the plays nevertheless, and Mrs. Ramsay saw that it would be all right for the moment anyhow. He would laugh at Minta, and she, Mrs. Ramsay saw, realizing his extreme anxiety about himself, would, in her own way, see that he was taken care of, and praise him somehow or another. But she wished it was not necessary. Perhaps it was her fault that it was necessary. Anyhow, she was free now to listen to what Paul Rayleigh was trying to say about books one had read as a boy. They lasted, he said. He had read some of Tolstoy at school. There was one he always remembered, but he had forgotten the name. Russian names were impossible, said Mrs. Ramsay. Vronsky, said Paul. He remembered that because he always thought it such a good name for a villain. Vronsky, said Mrs. Ramsay. Oh, Anna Karenina. But that did not take them very far. Books were not in their line. No, Charles Tansley would put them both right in a second about books. But it was all so mixed up with, am I saying the right thing? Am I making a good impression? That after all, one knew more about him than about Tolstoy, whereas what Paul said was about the thing, simply, not himself, nothing else. Like all stupid people, he had a kind of modesty, too, a consideration for what you were feeling, which, once in a way at least, she found attractive. Now he was thinking not about himself or about Tolstoy, but whether she was cold, whether she felt a draft, whether she would like a pear. No, she said, she did not want a pear. Indeed, she had been keeping guard over the dish of fruit without realizing it, jealously, hoping that nobody would touch it. Her eyes had been going in and out among the curves and shadows of the fruit, among the rich purples of the lowland grapes, then over the horny ridge of the shell, putting a yellow against a purple, a curved shape against a round shape, without knowing why she did it, or why every time she did it she felt more and more serene. Until, oh, what a pity that they should do it. A hand reached out, took a pear, and spoilt the whole thing. In sympathy, she looked at Rose. She looked at Rose, sitting between Jasper and Prue. How odd that one's child should do that. How odd to see them sitting there in a row, her children, Jasper, Rose, Prue, Andrew, almost silent, but with some joke of their own going on, she guessed, from the twitching at their lips. It was something quite apart from everything else, something they were hoarding up, to laugh over in their own room. It was not about their father, she hoped. No, she thought not. What was it, she wondered, sadly rather, for it seemed to her that they would laugh when she was not there. There was all that hoarded behind those rather set, still, mask-like faces, for they did not join in easily. They were like watchers, surveyors, a little raised or set apart from the grown-up people. But when she looked at Prue tonight, she saw that this was not now quite true of her. She was just beginning, just moving, just descending. The faintest light was on her face, as if the glow of Minta opposite, some excitement, some anticipation of happiness was reflected in her, as if the sun of the love of men and women rose over the rim of the tablecloth, and without knowing what it was, she bent toward it and greeted it. She kept looking at Minta, shyly yet curiously, so that Mrs. Ramsay looked from one to the other and said, speaking to Prue in her own mind, "You will be as happy as she is one of these days. You will be much happier," she added, "because you are my daughter." She meant her own daughter must be happier than other people's daughters. But dinner was over. It was time to go. They were only playing with things on their plates. She would wait until they had done laughing at some story her husband was telling. He was having a joke with Minta about a bet. Then she would get up. She liked Charles Tansley, she thought, suddenly. She liked his laugh. She liked him for being so angry with Paul and Minta. She liked his awkwardness. There was a lot in that young man, after all. And Lily, she thought, putting her napkin beside her plate, she always has some joke of her own. One need never bother about Lily. She waited. She tucked her napkin under the edge of her plate. Well, were they done now? No, that story had led to another story. Her husband was in great spirits tonight, and wishing, she supposed, to make it all right with old Augustus after that scene about the soup, had drawn him in. They were telling stories about someone they had both known at college. She looked at the window in which the candle flames burnt brighter, now that the panes were black. And looking at that outside, the voices came to her very strangely, as if they were voices at a service in a cathedral, for she did not listen to the words. The sudden bursts of laughter, and then one voice, Minta's, speaking alone, reminded her of men and boys crying out the Latin words of a service in some Roman Catholic cathedral. She waited. Her husband spoke. He was repeating something, and she knew it was poetry from the rhythm and the ring of exaltation and the melancholy in his voice. Come out and climb the garden path, Loriana Loralee. A China rose is all abloom and buzzing with a yellow bee. The words, she was looking at the window, sounded as if they were floating like flowers on water out there, cut off from them all, as if no one had said them, but they had come into existence of themselves. And all the lives we ever lived, and all the lives to be, are full of trees and changing leaves. She did not know what they meant, but like music the words seemed to be spoken by her own voice outside herself, saying quite easily and naturally what had been in her mind the whole evening while she said different things. She knew, without looking round, that everyone at the table was listening to the voice saying, I wonder if it seems to you, Loriana, Loralee, with the same sort of relief and pleasure that she had, as if this were, at last, the natural thing to say. This were their own voice speaking. But the voice had stopped. She looked round. She made herself get up. Augustus Carmichael had risen and, holding his table napkin so that it looked like a long white robe, he stood chanting, "To see the kings go riding by over lawn and daisy lea, with their palm leaves and cedar, Gloriana, Glory." And as she passed him, he turned slightly towards her, repeating the last words, "Gloriana, Glory," and bowed to her as if he did her homage. Without knowing why, she felt that he liked her better than he had ever done before, and with a feeling of relief and gratitude, she returned his bow and passed through the door which he held open for her. It was necessary now to carry everything a step further. With her foot on the threshold, she waited a moment longer in a scene which was vanishing even as she looked. And then, as she moved and took Menta's arm and left the room, it changed. It shaped itself differently. It had become, she knew, giving one last look at it over her shoulder, already the past. I hope you enjoyed that installment of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. There's a link to the full playlist of this book in the description of the video. If you'd like more of this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. Until next time, goodbye.